Okay, now we jump into our second reading, which comes from Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. Brothers and sisters, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us rid ourselves of every burden and sin that clings to us, and persevere in running the race that lies before us, while keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the leader and perfecter of faith. For the sake of the joy that lay before him, he endured the cross, despising its shame, and has taken his seat at the right of the throne of God. Consider how he endured such opposition from sinners, in order that you may not grow weary and lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood. Okay, so just again, to put it into context, if you remember last week, we started with Hebrews chapter 11, which is just defining faith, but then getting into what I call the hall of faith. So we heard about Abraham, but we know that the letter to the Hebrews chapter 11 includes much more than Abraham. It talks about Samson and Jephthah, and it talks about David. It talks about all kinds of people, actually, who are running the race in faith. That is to say that they have faith in God. They received some sort of promise from him. They received some revelation of his, and they persevered in their faithfulness because they were convicted by what they did not see. But it was the realization of what is hoped for. So in other words, they really believed in it, and so they remained faithful throughout their entire lives. And so the author talks about how because of their faith, they did seemingly impossible things. And he's using this as an example or as maybe motivation to preach to them, to basically say, like, look, I know that this is getting hard. So the Hebrew Christians that received this letter were finding it difficult because they had converted to Christianity, and then they found out that they were maybe encountering some of this division that Jesus is talking about, or maybe a lot of this division that Jesus is talking about in the gospel. And so they were like tempted to shrink back, to go back to their Jewish faith and just to abandon Christianity altogether. And so the author is in chapter 11 saying, like, look, all these people had faith and they died without seeing it. If you remember, that was a line I mentioned, that they died without having seen the conclusion of their faith. And so anyway, so then he talks about all these things. So then in chapter 12 is where he jumps in and he says, okay, so since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us rid ourselves of every burden and sin that clings to us and persevere in running the race that lies before us, while keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the leader and perfecter of faith. So he's like, okay, we got all these examples of people who were so faithful to God, and they believed all of the promises, even though they died without seeing the fulfillment of those promises. Nonetheless, he says, we are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses. So we're surrounded by them, this reality that we believe, which is that even though these people have died, they're not really dead. They're actually alive with God forever, especially after the resurrection of Jesus. When Jesus, through his death and resurrection, he unlocks the gates of heaven so that those righteous souls who lived before him could live forever in the heavenly kingdom. Because they're so glad, because their faithfulness to God was such that, like, yes, whoever God is, that's who's my king, and that, so like, and it's not whoever God is, it's like we believe in the one God, and so now we're ready to be members of his kingdom. So we are surrounded. So they dwell in heaven, and at the same time, in some mysterious way, they surround us. They actually cheer us on. So this image that he uses is persevering and running the race, as though like we're all in this stadium running the race to victory, to cross the finish line, which is found in Jesus. That he is the race, he is the finish line, he is the prize of victory. And so the saints are surrounding us. They've run the race, they've completed it, and so they're just cheering us on, and they're like, you can do it, all these different things. So we are surrounded by them. So therefore, we want to rid ourselves of every burden and sin that clings to us. You think of this, like especially I think today, it's what do athletes do? They do everything they can to eliminate anything that might hold them back a little bit. You think of this actually. So when I was growing up, football players, professional football players, college football players, whatever, they had all the normal padding, like knee pads and thigh pads and hip pads and shoulder pads and helmet and all the different things. But over time, what's begun to happen, and I'm not saying this is a good thing, but this is something that's happening, is you watch NFL players now, and a lot of them don't wear the knee pads anymore because they think it's too cumbersome. A lot of them don't wear thigh pads anymore because they think it's too cumbersome. Shoulder pads are getting smaller and smaller because it's too cumbersome. So what's happening is they're seeing that, well, maybe I could get a little faster. Maybe I could get a little edge if I just cut something off of my padding. And again, I'm not saying that's a good thing. In fact, it's probably harmful to athletes. But the point remains that these guys are working for an earthly crown, and so they're willing to cut off anything they can to get an edge, to get an advantage. The letter to the Hebrews is encouraging us to say, look, we're living for a spiritual, eternal crown that will not perish. And so how much more should we be willing to cut off every spiritual burden or hindrance that would prevent us from running the race to perfection, to victory? And so that's the image that is brought, is to rid ourselves of every burden and sin that clings to us so that we can persevere in running the race. And that word persevere is actually a big key, because the race of the Christian life is not a sprint, but it is more of a marathon. It is a long distance run more than it is a short distance sprint. Even for people who die young, seemingly die young, nonetheless, the point remains that it's not meant to be a sprint, but it's meant to be this long-term race. And so, all the more so, I don't want to be carrying around these heavy burdens for the duration of, like, a marathon, for example. For a sprint, maybe I can sprint with some extra weight, and even then it's like I know that it's holding me back, but at least I can get through the race. But if I am running this long-term race and I refuse to cut off some extra baggage, then I'm much more inclined to just give up altogether. I'm much more inclined to just say, you know what, it doesn't matter if I finish. I've got all this baggage. It's not worth it in the end. No, instead, how about I cut off the baggage that is unnecessary so that I can run to completion? And what is going to motivate me to do that is to look beyond the burden of the baggage and how much maybe I actually secretly enjoy it, to look beyond that and actually to keep my eyes fixed on Jesus. Because if I can keep my eyes fixed on Jesus, then I run not just some race, but I'm running toward the one that I love, the one who can set me free, the one who wants to purify my heart, the one who wants to make himself known to me by the fires of his love. So that's big. Okay, so then he says, looking to Jesus, for the sake of the joy that lay before him, he endured the cross, despising its shame, and has taken his seat at the right of the throne of God. So Jesus had to go through tribulation. He had to go through this incredible difficulty. And yet, he looked beyond the cross to see the glory that lay before him. And that was the very thing that moved him to run the race to perfection. And it's not, we're not suggesting here that Jesus ever would have stopped running the race, that he ever would have just given up altogether. But the image that is provided, I think, is a helpful image that, yes, he endured this incredibly shameful thing, maybe probably the most shameful way to be executed in human history. And yet he endured it. He looked beyond it to the glory, and that allowed him the strength from God to endure the shame, to endure the cross that he had to bear. And because of that, he turns out victorious. And so he sits at the right hand of God, which is the place reserved for the victorious priest king. And that's exactly who Jesus is. So then from there, the author to this letter says, consider, just consider. So take time to think it over, to mull it over, to let it sit in your mind. Consider how he endured such opposition from sinners. He endured such opposition. Jesus, who came to set us free, to save all of us. He came from heaven, the glory of God. He came. And the very people that he came to save are those who opposed him. So consider how miserable that must have been for Jesus. And yet he endured it. He persevered so that, or in order that, you may not grow weary and lose heart. If you think that you've got it rough, the author is saying, consider how much more difficult it was for Jesus, who was not a sinner, who was perfect and came to save sinners, and yet was rejected by those people that he came to save. How much worse and more seemingly difficult it would have been for him, and yet he endured. So whatever you've got going on, you're not perfect like he was perfect. And so you too can endure in running such a race. And then he says, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood. So he's writing to these people like, yeah, this is hard. It's difficult. You haven't been killed for it yet. You haven't shed your blood for this yet. And so keep on going. And maybe you'll get to that point where you actually have to shed your blood, maybe with Jesus. But even if not, just understand that Jesus did. He gave out every drop of his blood for this mission, for this cause, for this end. And he does it all so that you can be strengthened by his example. You can be strengthened by his grace. So keep on going. That's so, gosh, so good, so good. We actually, we'll continue moving on with this in the next week. Actually, next weekend, we'll continue with Hebrews chapter 12, which is just great. I love spending the extra time in it because it's just such a rich and powerful, I think it's so powerful and motivating chapter in the sacred scriptures. What a gift. I hope and pray this was a helpful Bible study for you this week. I just know even for myself, it just is every single week. It's awesome. And I always look forward to sharing it with you. So I will plan on seeing you next week. Peace.